BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast, where marine conservationists warn that farming pollution is ending up in the sea. We'll have more on that in just a moment. But let's start with a loaf of bread. All week we're following the journey of a UK loaf from seed to slice. Yesterday we heard from the seed breeders who developed the varieties for bread wheat known as Group 1 wheat. For the farmer, growing bread wheat in the UK can be a challenge. The harvested crop needs to be low in moisture, hit a 13% level in protein and have a high Hagberg falling number, which we'll hear about in just a moment. Last year's very wet summer meant millers were reliant on imported bread wheat and farmers here had difficulty with the fungal disease ergot. When I joined Bill Baker in his wheat field just outside Bury St Edmunds, it was lack of rain that was on his mind. Right. We've come into the middle of a wheat field and I'm standing hip height in a field of a variety called Cheer. I don't know if it's misnamed or not. I'm with Bill Baker, whose family have been farming here for many years. And I have to say, the first thing, of course, we look at is the ground. And this year, there are pretty big cracks.
I'm afraid we've had it incredibly dry, like most of the country, but even recently we haven't fared terribly well with the recent rains that have come. I think we've totaled 17 mils only in May. Bordering on drought, I would say. You
have brought your spade with you. Now we're going to dig into the soil and see. As we dig down, actually, Bill, you know that, this soil here, it has got a little bit of sort of loamy stuff in it, hasn't it, to hold it together?
And that's why we can grow milling wheat on this soil type. So as long as we look after this soil, it looks after the crops.
So when you're choosing what to put in the ground, who chooses?
So that's a very good question. And obviously with everything we grow, we have to have an eye on the end market. And we've been limited with choice in recent years. The breeders haven't come forward with anything terribly meaningful in terms of change. But now we've got two new varieties, Cheer and Vibe. But of course it has to be approved by the millers. There's no point growing a milling variety that doesn't have an end market.
We're here in the middle of the season, aren't we? We're looking at this crop. It's actually looking really well. But what do you want? Do you need quality or quantity?
So quality is absolutely key in a milling variety. We usually start wheat harvest around the 1st of August. One of the key drivers on the timing is to make sure that the grains are ripe and the moisture in the grain. Typically we wouldn't look to combine wheat above 18% moisture.
You can test your grain in the field, can't you?
Certainly.
You know that when this grain goes to cam grain, which is where we're going to go tomorrow, that it will be acceptable to them on a moisture level.
Yes, and if it's not, they can deal with it, drying it down to a moisture level that the end user needs.
You're also looking for protein.
The protein levels will be set by what we have done in the spring. We can't change that by the weather at harvest time. But the other one, of course, is Hagbergs, and Hagbergs need to be above 250. The Hagbergs are usually high when the grain first ripens, so that's what we're trying to preserve. And they will drop quite significantly if you go into an extended wet period.
Just tell me what a Hagberg is then.
It's all to do with how the loaf rises, I believe. We can't lose that quality. We will be ready to go into this crop the moment we see the moisture's down around 18% or lower.
How much pressure is there on you to make sure that your carbon footprint is acceptable?
It's very difficult with milling wheat. One of the requirements is nitrogen. We can grow cover crops to introduce nitrogen before we plant it. We are applying inputs as accurately as we can through GPS technology and have been for a number of years. We're reducing our carbon footprint. We're not ploughing unnecessarily, and we're always looking from financial grounds as well as environmental grounds to where we can reduce our carbon footprint.
We have imported milling grain for years and years, decades, haven't we? Is there a point at which you think UK should be growing more of its own bread wheat?
I think the challenge that we've got here in the UK is the climate, but surely it must be right for us to be producing what is a key ingredient in the staple diet of the population. My great-grandfather had a windmill and my grandfather was a miller, so I have sympathy with that local connection.
And you're called Bill Baker?
Yes, I know. It does amuse me when I think back to my grandfather being Windy Miller.
Farmer Bill Baker there. And tomorrow I'll be visiting a farmer-owned cooperative where thousands of tonnes of wheat are collected, cleaned and stored before being sent off to the millers. Camelina is a relative of oilseed rape. That's the bright yellow plant whose seeds produce oil for cooking and animal feed. Well, now scientists at Rothamsted Research have been working with colleagues in the United States to develop a genetically modified camelina seed oil for farmed salmon feed. Adding genes from the scarlet flax flower gives the camelina high levels of astaxanthin, which gives the fish antioxidants and also the red colouring they need to stay salmon pink. Professor John Napier from Rothamsted Research has been leading the work.
For a long time, we've been interested in supporting aquaculture, fish farming, to help it to be more sustainable. And fish farming, I think, is a really great way to produce animal protein for human consumption. But the sort of two key ingredients that are used in lots of farming systems, especially salmon and trout, is that you need to be able to feed the fish oils, and we've been working on making fish oils in camelina, and you also need to give them astaxanthin. Astaxanthin is the pink pigment. That's why salmon, when you buy it in the supermarket, has that pinky colour. It's because of the astaxanthin that they get in their diet, and that's just mimicking what they normally get in their wild diet, because they've been normally eating crustaceans, crabs, lobsters and things like that, which they have that astaxanthin, that pink pigment in those animals as well. So that's why a lobster is pink. It's astaxanthin.
For someone who eats salmon, though, it sounds as if you're giving them something that they wouldn't normally have, because normally it would be crustacean giving them the colour. Isn't this sort of vaguely unnatural? It's also genetically modified, isn't it?
It's genetically modified, but I certainly would push back on the suggestion that it's unnatural. I mean, we're just mimicking, like I said, what would be in the natural diet of the fish. And actually, I think the diet that the farmed fish get is probably more nutritious for the animals than the diet that they have in the wild, because in the wild, the animals are basically scavenging for whatever food they can find. In the farm, they're actually fed a pretty good diet because the farmer is trying to maximize the yield and the health of the animals. For sure, it's definitely GM, but we think you can only really make these plants with the healthy omega-3s and with the astaxanthin by using GM. You can't produce them by traditional breeding or even by gene editing. So GM is really, at the moment, the only technology that can deliver this sustainability benefit.
And this wouldn't be allowed in this country, then, to use that. So if you're creating this for commercial use, where would it be used?
For our omega-3 camelina, we have approval for cultivation in the US, and other companies also have approval for cultivation and use in aquaculture in Norway. And of course, Norway is probably the number one country for fish farming. Although there is a perception that GM is not really suitable or desirable for these production systems like aquaculture, actually, in reality, there's quite wide acceptance of GM ingredients in aquaculture in the same way as GM soy and protein feed is used in terrestrial farming almost ubiquitously now.
But not in the UK.
We don't grow it in the UK, but we certainly use GM soy in our animal feeds for sure.
And how much difference does it make that this is using plant-derived genes rather than bacterial pathways?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, from a regulatory point of view, actually, it doesn't really make too much difference because it's still GM, and it's GM whether you put a plant gene into it or whether you put a bacterial gene. So you still have to go through all that regulatory process.
Today, synthetic astaxanthin is used, isn't it? And that's produced through a chemical synthesis. So how much difference does it make using the oilseed instead?
It's more sustainable and it's greener to make it in a plant rather than make it in a big chemical vat and do it by chemistry. You can just get the plant to do the hard work and make it naturally by the approach that we've used.
Professor John Napier. We often report about pollution to rivers from farming, but the fact that this pollution ends up in the sea is sometimes forgotten. The United Nations Ocean Conference continues in Nice today with marine pollution on the agenda. The Marine Conservation Society, which campaigns for a better protected ocean, is calling for the UK government to lead with joined-up thinking, encouraging farmers and fishers to take up sustainable opportunities like using seaweed on soil and planting seagrass meadows. Gareth Cunningham, Director of Policy and Conservation at the MCS, says whatever we do on land, it affects the ocean.
Like every sort of pollution that ends up in the river, eventually it makes its way down to the sea. And unfortunately, agriculture runoff tends to be high in nitrogen and phosphates. And when they get into the sea, they cause issues, making the seawater more acidic. So adding to that, all the carbon emissions we've got problems with, it's an extra burden on the sea. And that leads to issues for all the plants and the animals that live in there.
How significant is the pollution caused by farming into the sea compared with other pollutants causing acidification?
There is no single smoking gun. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, really. So it's not just farming pollution that's the issue. It's in addition to sewage pollution and all the other forms of pollution that we have. But if we can tackle this, it's one extra bonus for the sea and helps it recover.
And so what can be done to help rectify the situation? Is there anything that can actually be done in the sea or by farmers to ameliorate the situation?
The good news is, yes, there are lots of things we can do. Within the sea, we can replant seagrass meadows, help restore our biogenic reefs, that's our mussels, our oysters, and our scallops. But it's also looking at kelp and seaweed, not just recovering them, but starting to use them for farming. So biochar from seaweeds is a really good way of capturing that excess nitrogen and phosphate and then putting it back on the field so it fertilises the field in a really sustainable way.
And why is shellfish important?
Shellfish are really important, particularly the reef building species. So the UK has a great number of these, from the blue mussels that you eat in the supermarket through to the larger varieties called horse mussels. Their shells, if you think back to your school days, they act like chalk really, so they help reduce some of the acidification. But they also help stabilise the seabed, which locks away some of that carbon dioxide that we're really worried about.
Should farmers have something then within the payment scheme that exists to help with these things? Because at the moment it's very much concentrating, isn't it, on wildlife and natural environments on land.
Absolutely. And this is where we need the government to start thinking about join up. It's about how do we connect everything we do all the way through to the sea. The sea is basically the sink of everything we produce. So let's deal with things at source, but do it with the farmers, not to them.
There's no government funding though, is there? I mean, we're having the spring statement. It's going to be very, very difficult, isn't it, to persuade the government to dip into their pockets even further.
It is, but it's very much taking a loan against our future. So if we invest in it now, the solutions are much, much cheaper. The longer we delay, the more expensive that becomes. So the interest payments will rocket. So yes, there might not be enough money now, but if we invest in it now, it's so much cheaper than 10 years or even 5 years' time.
And what are the benefits for farmers? If, you talked about biochar, you talked about seaweed. Is there anything you can do to change the mindset of farmers to link them more to the marine environment?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the projects that the Marine Conservation Society is involved in is called Ocean Literacy. And that's basically how do we connect people to the sea, their impacts to, but also the benefits from. And for farmers, the really obvious one is climate change is causing havoc. Think of the wet winters we've had recently. That's driven by climate change and all the impacts on our ocean. So if we can address those at the sea, the biggest carbon sink we have, the benefits will be seen on land for your crops and for the farmers as well.
Gareth Cunningham from the MCS. That's all from us. I'm Anna Hill. The producer is Sally Challoner. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.